Welcome to everyone. I'm Astell of the University of Notre Dame. It's my privilege to serve as moderator of our panel discussion tonight. We have invited 8 panelists: Douglas Burton-Christie, Loyola Marymount University; Lisa Dahill, Trinity Lutheran Seminary; Gilberto Cavazos-González of Catholic Theological Union; Bo Karen Lee, Princeton Theological Seminary; Bernard McGinn, University of Chicago Divinity School; Tim Hessel-Robinson, Bright Divinity School; Sandra Schneiders, Graduate Theological Union; and Philip Sheldrake, who's on his way, Cambridge Theological Federation. Our panelists represent different generations of membership in the society, different approaches to the study of Christian spirituality, and different Christian traditions. In preparation for tonight's discussion, I have asked our panelists to read Philip Endine's oft-reprinted article, Spirituality and the University, and then to prepare some responses to questions inspired by it. We hope that many of you have also had the opportunity to read or reread Endine's essay, first published in 1995 in The Way and posted as a PDF document on the SSCS website. As it turns out, Philip Endine, Campion Hall, Oxford University, is with us tonight, thanks to a visiting position this semester at Boston College. Welcome, Philip. Philip, would you raise? There he is over there. It's great to have you with us tonight. All right, I'm here at the podium, partly because it's hard to fit 9 people on 2 tables. I'm going to address very specific questions to our panelists, but I am happy to step back from the podium if any one of the panelists would prefer to respond standing. But our hope is that this will be a very conversational style panel discussion tonight. Okay, my first question, and this is to Doug and to Philip. I want to address this first question to you. At the beginning and end of his essay, Endine links the loss of Christian culture, especially in the modern West, to the emerging scholarly interest in Christian spiritual experience as an object of study. For Endine, this linkage between cultural loss and academic emergence is simply a given. Does Endine's description of the historical moment of Christian spirituality studies ring true to you? If so, would you qualify it in any way? If not, would you want to offer an alternative hypothesis in answer to the question, why has Christian spirituality emerged as an academic field, and why now? Okay, so you're on the spot, Doug and Philip.
D comes before P.
I just want to hold up before your eyes this unbelievable sheet of questions, beautifully expressed and composed, and a little daunting, that Astell prepared. So I'm going to begin the evening with what I think is a suitably apophatic answer, which is, I have no idea. That's actually an honest answer, in the sense that as I thought about the question behind the question, the attempt to seek out some correlation between loss of Christian culture and the development of this academic discipline, I really found myself at a loss. And I don't think that's a bad thing, because it caused me to think about a lot of different things at once that one would somehow want to consider in trying to formulate an answer. So I want to maybe even take a step back and consider even the assumption about loss of Christian culture. And I am quite certain, Philip, that even as you said that, you would like to say 10 other things to nuance and qualify that. So we'll just take that as a good invitation to think about this. In my own reflections, I was drawn to think about especially artistic expressions of Christian life and culture that I've been moved by in the past 15 or 20 years. And I want to name some of them, partly just to raise for our consideration what it even means to speak about loss of Christian culture, because I think there are different ways to think about that. Are we in a time of loss of Christian culture when we can look at Barnett Newman's Stations of the Cross, Krzysztof Kieslowski's The Decalogue, Eve Klein's Leap into the Void, Marilyn Robinson's Gilead, Terrence Malick's The Tree of Life, and the continuing invention and reclaiming of an ancient tradition in a contemporary idiom of the music of Arvo Pärt. I name these works and these figures partly to ask a question about what kind of cultural moment we're even moving through. And I, for one, find these artistic expressions thrilling, enlivening, encouraging expressions of Christian life and identity. They are perhaps not our mothers and grandmothers' understanding of what Christian spirituality might have consisted of, and in that sense they probably ring true in a way to Philip's initial intuition that culturally and religiously things have begun to feel anyway more fragmented, less whole, less coherent. But I guess it seems to me that part of what has happened in our own orientation to our work in this field is that we have been drawn, many of us, as these artists have been drawn, to thinking about what Christian life and faith means now in light of the momentous changes that we've seen in the late 20th and early 21st century. And part of that means responding to the particular form of spiritual hunger that we see and feel around us that sometimes is situatable in a coherent theological, ecclesial context, and sometimes isn't. So the work that we're doing, at least it seems to me, it happens in universities, in divinity schools, in different ways, mind you, at least is in part emerging in response to this very complex, but I think beautifully creative moment that we're living in. And I, for one, feel encouraged to be doing my work in the company of some of the people that I've named and all of you here. So that's my initial thought. Thank you.
Thanks, Doug. Philip.
Well, thanks, Doug.
Please.
Yes. I have a lot of sympathy with what Doug's saying, particularly that this is a very complicated moment, and I think it's very easy to caricature us as, particularly in Europe, I say that in contrast to North America, as kind of post-Christian, in a kind of easy, simple way. And I don't think it is easy and simple, but I agree with Philip. One sentence he used was, Christian faith is no longer a cultural habit. And I think that is certainly very true if I contrast the current situation in the UK, for example, with the way I was brought up, where it was definitely a cultural habit, and that kind of world has gone. So I agree to some extent. And there's no question, I think, that the emergence of Christian spirituality is at least contemporary with, and therefore finds a context within, this much wider trend, the quest for spiritual experience, for spiritual practice, for pursuing a spiritual life, somewhat detached from institutional religion, particularly hierarchical religion. We, as somebody put it, we live in a "is that it then" moment, meaning surely there has to be more. And this quest for the more has led a lot of people beyond a consumerist approach to life to seek something that they want to call spirituality. So some of this is a negative. It's a loss of trust in conventional religious authority, to be replaced by much more inner-resourced authority of personal experience, about which I have some questions myself, but that's, I think, the situation. I think it comes also from a belief that spirituality is no longer the possession of special elites. It's much more democratic, it's native to everyone, and therefore it can be very eclectic. But I think there are some other specifics, and that's why I agree with Philip, but want to qualify it, because I think there's a longer history specifically to Christian spirituality. After all, particularly from the Roman Catholic tradition, we grew up with immediately before the word spirituality with spiritual theology, and then immediately before that with that kind of two-tier system of ascetical and mystical theology that appeared in the kind of seminary theology manuals that were doing the rounds from the 19th century onwards until Vatican II, and perhaps a little bit after. And I think spirituality in the Christian tradition partly emerged from this as well. And that, I think, has a lot to do with the broader ressourcement movement in the 20th century, leading up to Vatican II, return to sources, biblical, patristic, historical. And then Vatican II itself set off a train of events which highlighted certain values through the documents of the Council. An attention to context, that famous phrase of John 23rd, attending to the signs of the times. Also a return to a single call of holiness through baptism, I think changed a lot of agendas. So I think spirituality emerges also out of a specifically Christian experience, countering earlier distinctions between a separated spiritual life and a purely material everyday life, recovering a sense that the spiritual life was collective rather than individualistic, re-engaging with liturgy, with ecclesiology, and also with a reconstructed post-moral theology version of ethics. And not to be limited to interiority anymore, but integrated with all aspects of human experience. Much of it undermining this distinction between a kind of lower ascetical path and a higher mystical path in the spiritual life, and re-engaging with newly resourced theology, freed from its subordination to, within manual theology, to a kind of moral theology that was itself subordinated to dogmatics. So that there was a kind of definitely a sort of a priori journey from dogmatics through a particular kind of moral theology to spirituality or the spiritual life as a sort of poor relation. That got reversed. So I think there's a lot of complexity around. So I agree with Philip that there was a cultural movement, but I also think there was something specific within the Christian theological tradition that shifted.
Okay, thank you. We're working our way through this essay, and I have a second question. This is directed to Lisa and Gilberto. And Dean portrays the modern academic students of spirituality as trying to overcome the separation between religious experience and intellectual reflection. At the same time, however, he emphasizes that their primary form is cognitive. My question is, does a primarily cognitive account of religious experience run the risk of reinforcing the very separation it sets out to overcome? If so, how can and must scholars in the field guard themselves and their students against the danger of reducing spirituality to their cognitive understanding of it? Another way of framing the question might be to ask, what is the proper role of spiritual practice in the academic study of Christian spirituality? Who wants to go first?
Okay.
Lisa? Lisa likes to stand.
It's a great question, and I'm honored to be invited to respond. So in thinking about this potential disconnect between the cognitive study of Christian spirituality and the practice or experiential dimensions of the field and our work, I've been grateful for Beth Liebert's work on practice and pedagogy in the study of Christian spirituality and others who've thought about pedagogy in relation to our field. But I want to focus especially in these quick remarks on the work of Mary Froelich in her study called Revising Questions of Definition and Method, published in Minding the Spirit, on the category of interiority as what she calls the uniquely defining methodological principle of this academic study of spirituality we're engaged in. She means interiority as that process of, here's another quote, standing inside and coming to know the lived reality of our own spirits. Building on Lonergan. Namely, that sort of self-awareness and self-differentiation that allows intimacy to take place with some other person or text or reality. That capacity to be open to the reality of an other out of a deep grounding in one's own experience, one's own sense of God and oneself and one's body and one's life and the world. It's only by means of such self-aware grounding in this reality for oneself, Froelich asserts, that any of us can have access to that interiority in someone else, in the texts, in and through the texts we read and the traditions we study. And so, in a sense, we can't know what we're seeing if we don't know what it is ourselves. If we don't know it ourselves in our bones, if we don't live there ourselves, how will we ever recognize this reality of the experience of God, of the lived life of Christian faith, of what Froelich calls the human spirit fully in act, unless we ourselves live it? So she writes, we cannot recognize the constructed expressions that radically engage the human spirit except on the basis of our own radical engagement. And that is hard. It's hard work. It's hard to remain open to that kind of transformation in our own spiritual practice and in our scholarship. And so for that reason, she names this practice of interiority as the methodological, defining methodological feature of our discipline, as creating itself the academic study of Christian spirituality as a spiritual discipline. It is itself a spiritual discipline to do this work of recognizing interiorities out of our own. And now a quick move. So scholars of sense phenomena and of sound in particular use the language of interiority also. It's not just us in spirituality. Sound as the sense that opens the interiority of reality. Liturgical scholar Kathleen Harmon writes, the sound a body projects is the consequence of interior properties and relationships. Sound reveals this hidden interiority. She uses the example of a violin, which we can see, but we can't know its quality until we hear it. Until it's only the quality of the wood, of the varnish, of the strings, of the internal architecture of the violin that allows it to sing or not. And it's only by means of its sound that that interiority is communicated to us. So Harmon writes, sound reveals this in a way that our other senses cannot. Sight perceives only the light reflected from the surface of a thing. Touch can perceive interiority, but only if it invades or destroys a thing, breaks inside the violin in order to see its interiority. Only sound can register the interiority of a thing without violating it. To hear a sound, then, is to participate in the interiority of the source of that sound, the violin, the human speaker and heart, the Word of God. This participation from the inside out, so to speak, dissipates our sense of separateness from the source of the sound, still Harmon. She writes finally, sound binds together interiorities that would otherwise remain unknown to one another. Sound uniquely binds together interiorities that would otherwise remain disconnected from one another. And so too does our discipline. I appreciate how Harmon's and others' phenomenology of sound illuminates my thinking about this discipline of ours as a unique form of listening, then. A distinctive spiritual scholarly practice of listening deeply, interiorities coming together.
Thank you, Lisa. Gilberto, what do you think?
Thank you, Lisa. I have to admit that my initial reaction to the question was confusion. As a Latino spiritualologian, I know in my corazón, or in my heart, that the academic study and teaching of Christian spirituality is in and of itself a spiritual practice. Having grown up in a traditional Mexican household on this side of the Rio Grande, I cannot even begin to conceive the separation of spirituality and religious experience from anything having to do with our cotidianidad. The cotidiano is the routine highs and lows of daily living, and it is for Latino theologians the locus theologicus. Intellectual reflection and religious experience can easily coexist and be mutually supportive. I understand that Philip Ending and I do not come at the spiritual from the same cotidiano. My socio-spiritual context, or Sitzenleben, is Mexican-American in its understanding of the cosmos. And while Euro-US cultures are often touched by the Greek concept of dualism, Mexican cultures usually embrace the concept of duality. The primary difference between dualism and duality is that while dualism considers two realities like light and darkness, practice and theory, life and death, as being in natural opposition, duality sees them as working together in a harmonious embrace. Duality cannot understand light without darkness, life without death, and as a result, I cannot fathom Christian spiritual practice without the Christian study of spirituality, and vice versa. I wrote an article for the NTR on the spirituality of study, and in it I explained that all study, even the study of math, which I don't like, can be a spiritual exercise if as Christians we accept a sacramental worldview. The academic study of Christian spirituality is an especially spiritual exercise and needs to be consciously self-implicating, and I would add socio-implicating. The duality of the two principles move the scholar to consider how the spiritual classic being studied affirms or challenges his or her own Christian life, within and without. I'm not an advocate for filling up our class time with spiritual exercises or fabricated religious experience, but I do think it's important to share faith with our students, which means to let them see us as believers and practitioners of what we teach. It's important for spiritualologians and Christian scholars to encourage each other and our students to see the study and the teaching of Christian spirituality as a faith-filled spiritual practice, where, to quote St. Bonaventure, I'm a Franciscan, so I have to quote St. Bonaventure, we will never read without unction, speculate without devotion, investigate without wonder, examine without exaltation, work without piety, know without love, understand without humility, be zealous without divine grace, see without wisdom divinely inspired. So I'm all for Mary Froelich's radical engagement of the classic within our own lives.
Okay. Thank you, both Lisa and Gilberto, for those responses. Question 3. Endine notes among scholars of Christian spirituality a significant consensus that the religious experience of persons and communities can be a fruitful object of interdisciplinary study, but also a divergence in views about what actually constitutes religious experience. For those who closely associate religious experience with mysticism, narrowly defined, the subject of Christian spirituality focuses on the individual's transformative encounters with God, usually studied in the context of what precedes and follows from such encounters. For those who associate spiritual experience primarily with lived religion and its formative practices, the focus is on the religiously inflected pattern of everyday life, individual and communal, with its ordinary demands, ethical challenges, beliefs, and cultural expressions. The former understanding of experience takes its bearing from what is rare and unusual, the latter from what is repeated again and again. My question to Doug, Sandra, and Bernie is this: is it important for any significant study of Christian spirituality, with the accent on Christian, to take both kinds of experience into account? If so, why and how? Does Christ make a difference in bridging these poles? I think I'm going to let our colleagues on my right fight for first place.
You want me to start?
Sure, Bernie.
Okay. Well, first of all, I'm pleased to know we have one significant consensus in the study of spirituality. There aren't going to be many others, I think. It seems to me that one of the problems we had, and I tended to say this before, is exactly with the malleability of the term experience. And I'd like to quote, I've quoted this before, but in 1931, the English philosopher Michael Oakeshott said, "Experience, of all the words in the philosophical vocabulary, is the most difficult to manage. And it must be the ambition of every writer reckless enough to use the word to escape the ambiguities it contains." And when we use the term experience or divide experience into two categories, as we have here, direct transformative experience, rare and unusual, and then kind of ordinary lived experience and practices of communities, common and frequent, it seems to me that we ratchet up the ambiguity of the term itself. First of all, it's obvious we have to study both. There can be no question of going back to some past where the study of spirituality, the study of mysticism, concentrated on particular unusual kinds of, quote, experience. Secondly, it seems to me, again, that we all have to use the word experience. There's no way not to. But we have to conceive of experience within the wider framework of the consciousness of the human subject. Many people think of experience as a kind of feeling or perception or whatever that happens at certain times and places, but obviously what we do when we study spirituality is much wider than the feelings or emotions that people have. It also involves their reflections. It involves their understanding. It involves the way in which they make decisions on that kind of basis. So that, and again, I'm betraying my Laniganian background here, but I think that the term consciousness is a much broader, more capacious way of understanding what we're studying when we study spirituality, and it includes experience, data, internal and external, as Lonergan was wont to say. The issue becomes, how do we relate the common consciousness of the Christian community and its members, all of their practices, liturgical prayer practices, devotional practices, reading practices, etc., to the sense of the deeper awareness that the mystics invite us to. And I think that's really the framework within which we have to try to address this kind of question. And it's quite obvious if we read the great mystics that the idea that somehow the special experiences, the rare moments, trances, raptures, visions, locutions, psychosomatic experiences, etc., were always admitted as a part of mystical consciousness, as one of perhaps the effects of a deeper awareness of God, but never as the core of the phenomenon itself. The core of the phenomenon is a deeper sense of God's presence in one's life, and that takes place not just in very special kind of moments, but it's supposed to be a deeper awareness of everything that goes on. One of the reasons I love Meister Eckhart so much is that he's one of the foremost proponents of that, but there are many others in the history of Christian mysticism. Think of Brother Lawrence and his sense of the sacrament of the present moment. So I think, in a certain sense, we can be misled by the bifurcation, and I think it's set up as ideal types. But I think we can also be misled a little bit by concentrating on the concept of experience itself, which might narrow the field of reference that we're trying to penetrate. I'll close with a statement from Origen, who talked about finding ta mystica, the hidden depths, the mystical depths in every form of Christian life and reality. I think that's what we're after, ta mystica. But they're not special. They're there in everything we do.
Thank you, Bernie. Sandra.
I probably need one of those.
Make sure she has a mic.
Well, I took Anne's question in reference to the article itself and went back to see where the question was coming from. And it seemed to me that the reference was to Dr. Endine's contrast in his article between what he reads as my position regarding spirituality as a distinct and quasi-autonomous subdiscipline in partnership with other theological subdisciplines, for example, moral or systematic or historical theology, under the big academic tent of the sacred sciences, and what he assigns as Professor McGinn's express preference for exploring spirituality through such disciplines as historical, systematic, or moral theology. That this was the location of the contrast that we were asked to comment on. First, I do not think the rigid specializations of the modern period in regard to religious or sacred sciences or any other major area of study are nearly as watertight as we once thought they were, when we could adequately or even absolutely distinguish by formal and material objects and distinct methodologies each different discipline from each other discipline. The tendency since the middle of the last century is definitely toward cross-disciplinary, multidisciplinary, and especially interdisciplinary approaches in most fields. And I have always regarded spirituality as intrinsically interdisciplinary, and I think we've just heard this a number of times, with theology and history among the disciplines which contribute to research projects in the field of spirituality. And that, I think, is where a certain amount of controversy has arisen. That theology and history don't constitute the field, but are among the disciplines that interactively allow us access to religious experience. But second, and seemingly in contrast, we may be even more aware today of how many legitimate and basically distinct and irreducible ways there are to study almost anything. For example, few people today think that there's one discipline, namely theology, which you learn in 4 years or so, which then renders you basically competent on the subject of God. Well, we used to think that. 3 years for the very smart. God can be studied from the angle of systematic theology, but also from critical theory, spirituality, psychology or sociology of religion, comparative culture, moral experience, art, philosophy, and any number of other disciplines probably, in which these subdisciplines interact. On the subject of whether spirituality is an ingredient in, and I think this is where the question is spirituality an ingredient in, a subdivision of, or a quasi-autonomous discipline in relation to theology? And I think here an analogy might help. The analogy from aesthetics. One could study the theory of the beautiful, aesthetics, by studying the history of architecture in France during the Middle Ages, or by studying a particular type of art, for example, painting or drama, or by learning how to perform and or teach an art, for example, playing the violin. But one can also study aesthetics, the theory of the beautiful, in itself, either theoretically or critically. For example, one might be interested in such theoretical philosophical questions as what constitutes the beautiful? And how is beauty related to the true and the good? How is the beautiful, qua beautiful, perceived or recognized regardless of the medium in which it is manifested? And is it the same in dance, poetry, sculpture, or film? How does the intuition of beauty differ from scientific knowledge? Or even, how is the beautiful related to the ugly or the violent? We sometimes hear talk of an aesthetic of violence. What is the difference between fine art and popular art? And we could go on and on. In other words, these are specifically studies of aesthetics. So not through the beautiful, realized in art or drama or something, but of beauty itself. Analogously, I would contend that one can study spirituality as it has been lived throughout Christian history, as Bernie was just talking about it, or as an intrinsic and generative dimension of systematic, moral, or fundamental theology, and we're much more aware of that today, or as a critical function in relation to these other subdisciplines, or as an expression of theology in religious practice, which we've already heard quite a bit about. But I would maintain one can also study spirituality itself, inquiring into the nature and validity of religious experience across or within particular traditions, such as Christianity. What constitutes or qualifies experience as religious? Is or how is religious experience related to a confessional tradition like Christianity? How are we to explain mystical experience in relation to other more common religious experience? Are or how are religion and spirituality related? What are the criteria of adequacy of experience which is presented as religious? Not everything that comes across our desk as spirituality is necessarily that. Is transcendent experience and experience of the transcendent the same thing? One can even raise questions about the necessity and role of theological competence and moral development in the development of healthy spirituality, and conversely, the necessity and role of spirituality for the adequacy of theology or for the development of the moral life. So, in my opinion, spirituality can be an ingredient in, a dimension of, various theological specializations. But it can also be an autonomous discipline which studies religious or quasi-religious experience as such, that is, as experience and as religious, within a particular tradition, or across traditions, or in relative abstraction from traditions, as I think Doug was pointing out a little bit ago. I think the major newness of the contemporary discipline of spirituality in relation to its predecessors in the 18th, 19th, and early 20th centuries is that spirituality today is increasingly recognized as a necessary contributor to any adequate theological investigation, and that it also functions among the sacred sciences as an equal partner rather than as a tool, practical consequence, or interesting decoration of other disciplines. I do think that this identity and role of spirituality is, for Christian spirituality, a function of the incarnation and its implication of revelation through and divinization of the whole spectrum of created reality, as Bernie was saying.
Thank you. Doug, you want to weigh in on this one?
I believe my name is listed there. Yes, I will follow my teacher. Well, I appreciated your question, and one thing I felt as I was reading it was, I came to the immediate answer, yes. Gosh, that was so easy. They must be held together always. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized what a good question it is for thinking about both historical traditions of spiritual practice as well as those that we encounter in the contemporary world, in that something that characterizes, I think, both places, the whole history of the tradition, is that we see in these texts and traditions a hunger for big experiences, a big experience. And notwithstanding your helpful caveats, Bernie, I'm just going to let that stand for the moment. And a big experience of the divine, to be taken up into the divine. The tradition will sometimes call it, at its highest level, a unitive experience, or an experience of profound unity, almost disappearing into the divine. And there's also something that you see almost everywhere, it seems to me, which is that the yearning for that big unitive experience gets people in trouble, because they start to yearn for it at the cost of paying attention to their own lives, to their communities. And when I think about the desert traditions that I have studied, it's amazing how many times the question will come up from a younger monk to an elder, an abba or an amma, having to do with how do I get to that higher place? And almost always the answer that comes back is to invite the young monk or nun to return to whatever they were doing with greater care and attention, which is their manual labor, their life in community, the recitation of scripture, the mundane, ordinary shape of their lives. And what you also start to realize is that it's out of that ground that the larger, deeper, more encompassing sense of the divine arises. So it seems like the most obvious thing to say that it's a reciprocal process, but I think it's very interesting, both how kind of delusional people can be about the sense of taking shortcuts beyond the mundane and the ordinary and the quotidian to get to the big experience, and how the wisest of our teachers continually invite those who are seeking that to return to their own fundamental responsibilities and commitments. So that reciprocal relationship between the ordinary, mundane existence, I think Meister Eckhart calls it living from the divine ground. Teresa of Avila, at the end of her Interior Castle, is speaking all about community out of the depth of that most profound unitive experience. So the tradition wants to hold this together, I think, in some kind of whole vision. And I think we're becoming more sensitive to that. And the last thing I would just say is that I'm so happy that you mentioned lived religion. It feels to me like that's the rise of lived religion as an area of study has so much to teach us in spirituality about careful, minute attention to the particulars of how people actually live, how they configure their lives, how they understand themselves to be practicing some kind of spiritual discipline. And it's descriptive, phenomenological, textured kind of character also helps us to avoid, in our attempt to interpret such experience, bypassing the actual fabric of life for the sake of the big idea beyond it. So I, for one, am very grateful for that, and I think it's a promising part of our work.
Thank you. All right, we move on to the fourth question. Still on the theme of experience, Andian suggests that the modern academic study of Christian spirituality is marked by an expanded scope that takes into scholarly account the experiences of many different kinds of Christians. Catholic, Protestant, lay, religious, men, women, rich, poor. The experience is not just of Christians in the geographic regions closest to major Western universities, but also that of people living in countries all around the globe in different language zones in contact with other world religions. At issue is the Christian spirituality of groups and individuals whose diverse experience of God is partly conditioned by their specific cultural, economic, historic, gendered, ethnic, and professional experience. My question to Bo, Lisa, Tim, and Gilberto is this: how far are we from reflecting this expanded scope of inquiry? What are the biggest challenges, theoretical and practical? What is the significance, historical, theological, ethical, methodological, etc., of such an expanded scope? Maybe let Bo go first.
And I have some back issues, so I'd be happy to stand, and that gives you a chance to sit as well.
Good. We'll do musical chairs.
Thank you for these thoughtful questions, Anne. I'd like to open my remarks this evening with an anecdote, or rather an observation. At last year's AAR, the final session of the Christian Spirituality Group, for those of you who were there, if you remember, it focused on Latino spiritualities and explored the ways in which larger conversations in the Guild might be enhanced by the particularities of the Latino tradition, or more properly stated, traditions. One panelist spoke of how she was taught in her religious upbringing, which happened to be Protestant and Pentecostal. She was taught not to read Catholic literature, least of all the mystics. She was shocked to discover later on in her theological training that she had missed out on a vast array of resources by which to understand and articulate her own experience of faith, particularly her life in the Spirit. She lamented the lack of conversation, the mistrust that had marked her earlier expressions of faith. Grateful to have outgrown those limitations, she urged the audience similarly to cross implicit and explicit theological divides. What was striking to me during that session was to note that some of these divides persist even today, not only at the level of everyday discourse, but also in our scholarship. This lack of conversation, this lack of trust can go in multiple directions. Not only Pentecostals distrusting Catholic mystics. Dear brothers of mine at St. John's Abbey, faithful Benedictine monks, have shared stories of their earlier distrust of Protestants and Protestant spirituality. One father said to me, "What do Protestant wannabe monks have to teach us Catholics?" And he was surprised when he went to Taizé, founded by Brother Roger, who was not Catholic, though he was a closet Catholic, apparently. For these brothers who share these stories, they confess that face-to-face exposure to Protestant classmates in graduate school and careful study of Protestant theology is what helped to transform their suspicion into radical openness and even a desire to learn deeply from this counter-tradition. This spirit inspired the founding of, as many of you are familiar with, the Collegeville Institute for Ecumenical and Cultural Research, which is based on the conviction that the best theology can be done when multiple conversation partners are seated around the table representing necessarily different Christian traditions. So, okay, these stories come from about 2 decades ago, although we have made great strides in recent years toward creating more space at the table, we have yet a ways to go. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Rublev's beautiful Trinity icon. If you look carefully, the 3 persons of the Trinity are seated at a table, at table fellowship, with a wide opening at the 4th seat, representing an ever-open invitation for the onlooker to enter into communion. It's open to all who would look. However, it's not rare, even in conversations centered around spirituality and inclusive sensibilities, it's not rare for various parties to be missing. At best, we simply don't have exposure to other voices. At worst, a secret part of us is happy to exclude them. Two examples that illustrate reasons for this divide. I have a colleague in the Netherlands who's doing very exciting and important research on Reformed pneumatology. Who knew there was such a thing? Karl Barth, the foremost theologian, arguably, of the Reformed tradition in the 20th century, died before he could get to his pneumatology. It's all Christology, and he just didn't have time. He said he looked toward pneumatology but couldn't ever get there. And so this Dutch theologian is writing on Reformed pneumatology, and yet he's not translated into English. So we have language barriers, which are reasons for this divide. Another divide. In Mozambique, there is a woman who is known by many circles as the Protestant Mother Teresa. Grassroots movements, powerful lay spirituality, multiplying in numbers. And yet theologians will probably think, what do lay grassroots movements have to teach us theologians? And so what do we gain from interacting with these lay movements? A colleague of mine is arguing, actually, that these, in this case, neo-charismatic movements help to elucidate 12th and 13th century erotic mysticism. He calls this the new love mysticism. That's an interesting claim, and I wonder if things might be gained by bringing these unexpected conversation partners into dialogue. I do laud some international representation. We have Michael O'Sullivan representing Ireland. We have Michael Battle teaching us about Ubuntu theology from South Africa, and yet there's so many parts of the world that we simply aren't privy to hearing and learning from. What are the challenges? I think there's a theoretical challenge and two practical challenges that come to mind. Theoretically, these represent different theologies on key questions of theology. However, might there be a core upon which we can agree? Some of us in elementary school learned about the melting pot theory, or is it a tossed salad, or is it a potluck? Well, the danger of the melting pot is when you mix in all these ingredients, you have no idea what the final result will taste like. It could be a disaster, or it might taste surprisingly delicious. It's a risk. Melting pot is risky. An analogy that I learned at an ecumenical Protestant Catholic theological conference years ago was maybe it's about inhabiting the same house. We might share the first floor, common living space, dining room, and kitchen, but we then go into separate quarters on the second and third floor. We have common ground, and yet we dignify our differences, in the language of Rabbi Jonathan Sachs. So maybe there is a way to share ideas without becoming this amorphous melting pot, preserving our distinctions, and yet being somehow coherent. I think there are two practical challenges for why we don't widen the conversation. The first I regard to be existential, namely that many of us are at times threatened by difference. Difference can call us out, difference can correct us, it can expose us. It takes a magnanimous spirit to come to the conclusion that I could be wrong, or my methodology might have some holes in it. And for most of us, magnanimity and humility are not virtues gained overnight. Peter Oakes, the founder of the interreligious scriptural reasoning movement, writes in his beautiful essay, Morning Prayer as Redemptive Thinking, that the practice of morning prayer and opening up to the God of the universe reminds us that we are not the king of the universe. It reminds us that we could be wrong, that we might be missing something. So maybe morning prayer is part of this solution. I think the second practical challenge is simply the practical constraint of time. Do busy scholars, burdened by the demands of academic and personal life and committee obligations, have time for extra meetings, gatherings, and deeper conversations? Many of us are simply spent. We don't have time to have fun hearing other voices and getting to know one another. I'll close with addressing the final part of the question, the significance of such an expanded scope. First of all, ethically, I think Jonathan Sachs has something to say about the dignity of difference, the dire importance with which we need to engage with civility in our discourse and deep respect. And I would add, with Peter Oakes, a deep desire to learn from the radical other, not just to respect them, but to really long to learn from them. Finally, I think another significance is, as one of my colleagues reminded me, this colleague happens to come from an African-American Pentecostal tradition. He reminded me that the unity of the Spirit, which celebrated multiplicity of languages, first exploded at Pentecost. This unity was a mark of the vital presence of the Spirit and the Spirit's work among us. So, according to this line of reasoning, coming together, even with our various dialects, personalities, perspectives, and methodologies, coming together is a representation of that Spirit at work. I would hope to God that murmurings of that same Spirit, even vital signs of the Spirit, would be found in our midst. Thank you.
Yes, again, a great question. Thank you, Anne. So who's not at the table? What voices aren't being heard? In my earlier response, I used Mary Froelich's category of interiority. And I want to use that again in two different ways here. First, to reclaim the category of interiority, in Froelic's sense, can help to reclaim space for the radical healing that survivors of trauma and abuse and violence experience. I've written about this in other places elsewhere, but didn't have this language at that point, so to claim that here. Too many Christian spiritualities outside this room still argue in undifferentiated ways for the necessity of self-sacrifice, of self-transcendence, of other-centering, as if this were a universal good for all people, always, and in ways that can further do violence to those who have experienced trauma or abuse. For whom precisely that dynamic and reality of interiority, which Froelich again defined as standing inside and coming to know the lived reality of our own spirits, is precisely what has been beaten or attacked out of such a person. Who then has been forced to become overly oriented toward others. So other-centeredness not necessarily as a sign of holiness, but as a sign of trauma. Interiority, in that sense, is often among the very first things that are lost in those who are beaten into submission and silence. And the freedom, Froelich notes, in this language, not just for scholars in our field, but for us all as human beings and Christians, for deep presence to God in oneself and one's own reality and needs and body and desires and perceptions must surely underlie any healthy Christian life. So the voices of trauma survivors in relation to Christian spirituality, first. And second, while holding on to that marvelous sound resonant language of interiority as an essential aspect of what we do as scholars in Christian spirituality, I also want to place it alongside another metaphor, call it exteriority, or moving outdoors, outside. Canadian poet and philosopher of language Robert Bringhurst writes, so here's a quote, "In the early days of the alphabet, letters often lived outside, where they could get fresh air and light. In the long reign of manuscript and print, they have mostly lived indoors. And in the short reign of the keyboard and the microchip, letters have mostly lived in an airless world, fully divorced from forest, mountain, garden, earth." Certainly the textual bias of our own tradition and of our discipline, of any academic discipline, focused as we are on texts text and scripture and screens and more texts and texts interpreting texts and words interpreting words and intertextuality and all of that, I wonder if we might find it hard in this text-mediated world of ours to know how to listen adequately to the kinds of experience of God and reality that are encoded in indigenous oral cultures, immersed in their immediate ecological location and world. We have a lot to learn from them about what it means to live immersed in one's bioregion, listening to it and to the creatures filling it as the primary texts and relatives of one's life, the stories and myths and rituals of culture and religion emerging in essential relationship to these waterways and migratory animals and dangerous and healing plants. What would research in spirituality look like in an oral context? This sort of radically different learning to listen at a human level to the wisdom and kinds of knowing practiced by those who largely remain in relationship with their surrounding ecology has the potential to broaden our own definitions of spirituality, the languages of body and ritual and vision in relationship, essential relationship to the natural world, and to open us to places and lenses of natural mysticism in our own traditions as well. Perhaps that's what Doug is doing in his new book, Contemplative Ecology. I haven't read it yet. And then, in this suffocation of the lives of species and air and water and climate our bodies depend on and are, can we then step outside of this human bubble we live in, these texts and screens that confine us here in our discipline as well, and learn to listen again to the interiority being expressed and cried out in the voices of all the creatures and creation around us on their own terms? To truly listen at length to the voices of creation, like learning a new language as a Christian practice? What do hours of attention next to a hidden part of Alum Creek near my home in Ohio have to teach over the course of months or years about my own animal life and the needs of other creatures, including human ones, and who God is? Listening adequately to the poorest human beings on Earth and right around us as climate change accelerates, listening adequately to threatened indigenous cultures, still in some fuller measure of essential relationship to the natural world around them, listening adequately to the species and forces of creation itself. There's our great stretching out into the Word made fully flesh.
My response takes two parts, basically. The first part is responding to the introduction to your question and then to the question itself. And my response to the introduction is connected to a reaction that I had when reading Philip Ending's essay. At issue, just to remind you what you just said, at issue, you say, is the Christian spirituality of groups and individuals whose diverse experiences of God are partly conditioned by their specific cultural, economic, historical, gendered, ethnic, and professional status. And I might add other identifiers as well, but we could be here a while if we listed all of them. So, but I'd like to maybe push on that a little bit, add a nuance to it, and perhaps it's implied in your question, but I'll make it explicit that all Christian spirituality is conditioned by these contextual factors, that we can't pick out certain groups by these identifiers, whether they're cultural, economic, historical, gendered, etc., but that all of our religious experience is in fact conditioned by these contextual factors. And perhaps what you're driving at is that the modern academic study of spirituality has forced us to acknowledge this reality in ways that we hadn't previously. I had a similar reaction when reading the essay, Philip Ending's reflections from 1996, that the rise of the discipline of spirituality is partly due to a reaction against a kind of theology that excluded human experience. And so again, I'd like to maybe nuance that a bit and wonder. I wondered as I was reading and reflecting on the role and the future of spirituality as a discipline. Is this any longer true of theology, if it ever was, that we could exclude human experience from our theologizing, no matter how objective academic theologians thought they were being, insulated as they or we were from the experience of others whose experience was not like our own. And we could live in some sort of blissful illusion that what we were doing was scientific and rigorously exclusive of the taint of our own subjectivity. But now, I think, and I think Sandra hinted to this earlier, is there any kind of theological reflection, whether it's historical, systematic, constructive, moral, practical, is there any kind of theological reflection that can any longer be taken seriously if it doesn't self-consciously take into account the limits and the richness of human contextuality, social location, experience? So that was, those were some reflections I had that I think relate to the root of your question. So on to the question itself, how are we doing in reflecting this expanded scope of inquiry in our guild? I don't know. I think that there is a desire to expand that scope of inquiry, and we make halting steps in various ways. But I'd raise up a couple of challenges I think that we have in attempting to do this. I appreciate that we've come at this question thinking about whose voices are at the table, or this expanded scope of inquiry from different perspectives. I'm looking at it as having to do with a broader range of human experience than the kind of North American, European perspective and experience that's kind of dominated our guild. So I think part of the challenge is just that, is who is here at our meetings, at our sessions, on our boards, whose writing shows up in our journals, what books are we publishing or reading. Just quick glance around us, our room here, tells us that our guild remains largely comprised of Anglo, North American, and European scholars, either Catholic or Protestant, whose work largely focuses on a Western spiritual canon, so to speak. And by that canon, I mean texts, figures, practices that we're all familiar with in many ways, and even methods, which, as Lisa has just pointed out, consist largely of textual study. So I think that's one of the challenges that we face and have to wrestle with. And then partly also it has to do with, related to that, our methodologies and choices of subjects. Again, the focus of our work is largely on written texts, and particular kinds of texts at that: scripture, the spiritual classics, however that's defined, other classics, quote unquote, of Western literature. So I think in order to continue expanding our scope of inquiry, we have to engage other kinds of texts, artifacts, experiences. I'm thinking of, I really appreciate what Lisa just outlined for us about indigenous cultures and the ecologies of those cultures, all our cultures, but I'm thinking of things like folklore and memoirs and ritual and the kinds of arts that are beyond kind of our Western experience in that canon, which call for different kinds of methods, the different kinds of inquiry when we are trying to study them. So I'd also point to the essay that Lisa recently wrote in Spiritus about where she engaged the novel Purple Hibiscus by the Nigerian author Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, a novel that's sort of outside the Western canon and trying to interpret from that, what that text has to say about spirituality, what's embedded in there about the interiority or spirituality. But there are other kinds of texts and artifacts and practices I think that we have to pay attention to as well, like technology and social media and its explosion and the ways that people's lived experience, which is often rendered religiously, is being expressed and accessed in those ways. So I guess just to summarize, it's that I think we still have work to do in terms of our choices of what we study, and we are somewhat limited, or have been limited, in that we are a very text-oriented kind of people. That's not bad, it's just who we are, and have to recognize the challenges that we face there, and the choices of the ways in which we go about studying them. The last thing I'd say about that is that from the beginning, the academic study of spirituality has insisted on multidisciplinarity, interdisciplinarity, that we need to draw on other bodies and fields of knowledge in order to most fully understand the human religious experience. And so I think that's an explicit piece of how we go about things. I think it's always well for us to be attentive to what bodies of knowledge and what kinds of disciplinary methods that we are attempting to apply to our subjects. So when I say that there are different kinds of experiences, texts, rituals, practices, etc., that we should attend to, that also means that we have to apply other kinds of inquiries to them. So I just think we should always be expanding our conversations within the academy itself, outside of the religious academy, and seeking those conversations, seeking those bodies of literature that can help us to interpret our subjects. So.
Thank you, Tim. Gilberto.
Thank you. I'd like to start. We were advised to begin from a specific context or a specific angle, so I'd like to start with a little song. And if you know it, sing it with me. I grew up. I'm Catholic, obviously Franciscan, but during the summer we were economically ecumenical, meaning we couldn't afford summer school, so we went to, we hit the Lutherans, the Baptists, the Presbyterians, all the Bible schools we possibly could. And at one denomination, we're all Latinos in this room, and we begin to sing this song. If you know it, sing it with me. Jesus loves the little children, all the children of the world. Red and yellow, black and white, they are precious in his sight. Jesus loves the little children of the world. Well, I heard this song, and we sang it, and I continue to sing it. But I asked my first contextual theological question to the Bible school teacher, and I said, does he also love us? She's like, what? I said, well, red and yellow, black and white, where does that leave the brown kids? Does Jesus also love us? And so I would start with that because I'm coming at this as as a child who was excluded from the love of Jesus at a very tender age. I found out later he loves us a lot. Anyway, speaking as a little brown child who has now grown up, I live my faith and I do my research and teaching as a spirit-filled reality. However, the spirit in question for me is both the Holy Spirit of our Lord Jesus and at the same time the cultural and ethnic spirit of my Mexican roots. That defines for me my Christian spirituality. As a Mexican American scholar, I sometimes feel isolated in scholarly gatherings such as this one. I'm usually the only one of my kind. There aren't that many Latino theologians. Latino theologians rarely, and I would chastise my sisters and brothers, rarely talk about spirituality in a specific manner. Oftentimes, when you read our theological work, we will focus on ethnic and cultural identity, social involvement, popular religion, tradition, and traditioning. I like to remind my hermana and hermano theologians that identity politics, social action, popular religion, tradiciones, and traditioning are all spiritual. They help us to manifest our Latino spiritualities. There is no one Latino spirituality. The question asked also about challenges. I believe the biggest challenge to the study of Christian spirituality today is that we need to bring an end to what I call a subtle racism of omission, just like the song Jesus Loves the Little Children. Like the sins of omission, racism of omission harms its neighbor not by what it does, but by what it fails to do. Latino theologians, a lot of us, tend to omit the work of spirituality, and I call Latino theologians to task because they tend to look at spirituality as a soft discipline. At the same time, scholars of spirituality and spiritualogians omit on a regular basis the work of Latino theologians and even Latino spiritologians. I do not see much by way of Latinization in the works of many of you here tonight. I find that sad and irresponsible. As Christianity in the United States becomes more and more Latino, I am convinced that the work by Latino theologians on the cotidiano, on traditioning, on beauty, on social action have much to contribute to our study of Christian spirituality. A lot of times you simply don't know where to begin, and so I can't offer a challenge without offering some advice. I would invite you to peruse the Journal for Hispanic Latino Theology. It's online. I go to the Orbis table. Latino theologians are published a lot by Orbis, not me, but the others. And I would especially invite you to peruse the 2 volumes edited by Miguel de la Torre called Hispanic American Religious Cultures, that was published in 2009 by ABC Clio. It contains the work of Catholic and Protestant Latino theologians on a variety of topics important to our people. They forgot spirituality, so I convinced them that we needed an article on spirituality, and luckily I was invited to write it. Okay, that'll teach them. It's a good source, like I tell my students, especially for the bibliographies after each article. I've often heard that the study of spirituality, has been said so tonight, is interdisciplinary and self-implicating. This understanding, I think, could benefit a lot from the socio-centered nature of Latino theology. The study of spirituality cannot simply be self-implicating. If it is to be a Christian study of Christian spirituality, then it needs to be socio-implicating as well as self-implicating. I think that these two, instead of being dualistic, can be a duality of harmonious nature.
Thank you very much, Gilberto, and all of you for your responses. We move on to a fifth question. And it's a set of questions for Bo, Tim, and Philip. Many scholars of Christian spirituality teach that subject at institutions with definite theological traditions and commitments. Do you agree with N. Dean's observation that an openness to studying spiritual experience can, quote, radically change how people understand and appropriate their own theological commitments, unquote? If so, how is this potential to bring about a transformative change best to be viewed by theological schools? As a challenge, a worry, an opportunity for theological renewal? So, who wants to go first? Philip.
Was that a question? Right. I have a microphone in front of me. Okay. Thank you. Okay. Well, very briefly, I agree with Philip, the other Philip's observation. The positioning of spirituality within theology and its study has an impact. Perhaps I'd qualify it by saying, or should have an impact on theological commitments. Philip, I think it was Philip who described spirituality as potentially and provocatively a reform movement within theology. I've certainly said much the same myself, and I know one or two others have, but I think it was Philip. I first read it in a piece in Christian Spirituality Bulletin, Spiritus's predecessor. And I have to be honest and say, from my UK context, this sometimes means that spirituality is rather firmly resisted by people who continue to espouse the classic post-Enlightenment scientific model of theology against the dangerous dilution promised by this soft discipline of experience, subjectivity, the practical devotion and piety. That's how they would see spirituality. I remember when I was a professor at Durham University in England, having conversations with one of my colleagues, Professor Andrew Louth, who was a great patristic scholar and orthodox theologian, and also somebody, one of the scripture people, who had very strong views about the positive impact of spirituality on theology. And as they'd been in the department a heck of a lot longer than me and continued there after I left, I could see what the problem was, because it was very marginalized. And Andrew, in a public lecture, very sharply and unapologetically said this: spirituality is that which keeps theology to its proper vocation, that which prevents theology from evading its real object. That didn't go down terribly well. As the contemporary Basque theologian Gaspar Martinez suggests, commenting on the German theologian Johannes Baptist Metz, theology begins in prayer and ends in prayer. And I think beyond being a specific academic field with its own content and interdisciplinary methods, spirituality also, I think, has this second role to be a central, not incidental dimension of the wider field of theology. And I see it in these terms, that spirituality acts as a kind of synthesizer of the theological enterprise as such. understood as a whole rather than in this sort of fragmented set of subdisciplines, or the cake that is perpetually divided and subdivided, which is another reason, by the way, why some of the more traditional members of the department were worried about spirituality arriving, because it was going to be another slice of the cake, which meant that all their slices would necessarily be narrower, because the cake remained the same size, if you see what I'm getting at. I'm not seeing it as simply as that, but as a viewing theology as a whole, in fact reminding theology that it is a whole. In that sense, spirituality is a kind of holistic element that gives theology shape. It speaks of what theology is for. Why bother to do it at all anyway? But having said that, I have a slight question mark about the concept of do, as in doing theology. Because it seems to me, as a number of people have already said very succinctly, theology is ultimately a form of spiritual practice. It is self-implicating. Another way of putting it is that it shapes the theologian. Theology, therefore, for me, and this is a phrase that I've used several times before, actually involves not so much a doing of something as becoming something, becoming a theological person. A true theologian, it seems to me, seeks, at least, aspires to live rather than do in a technological sense. In the aftermath of modernist distinctions between theory, apparently bracketing out commitment, and experience or practice, it's worth recalling that in the history of theology, theory doesn't concern abstract knowledge, but derives from the Greek word theoria, that is to say, contemplation. Or to paraphrase Archbishop Rowan Williams, soon to escape back to Cambridge, to think about God is to think of God, and thus to become involved with God.
Thank you, Philip. So, Jim, you want to go back?
Sure. When I was about to enter graduate school a number of years ago to pursue the academic study of Christian spirituality, I was urged by some mentors, theologians, to ground your study in theology. And what I took them to mean was that they did, in fact, suspect religious experience or spirituality itself as slippery, as unmoored from text, tradition, community. We live in the spiritual but not religious culture, and this concerned them. So I should ground what I was doing in the study of real, solid theology. I arrived in Berkeley to study with Sandra, and she was there to warn us, beware the theologians. It was a little more nuanced than that, as you heard her say earlier. But, so this question I think is a really interesting and live one, and the question reminds me of something that I read some years ago in one of Philip's writings, Philip Sheldrake's writings, where he said spiritual experience or spirituality is, while it's shaped by theological commitments and traditions, that often the religious experience, I like the way you said this, overflows the boundaries of our carefully constructed systems. And I think that's what the study of the history of Christian spirituality shows us very vividly. It's shown me that as we engage in the lives and the texts of these figures that we consider classic, that their experiences and leadership and the writings that they've produced have given rise to new forms of religious expression, and it's rooted in their own experience. The reshaping of theological and ethical systems emerges in the process of the emergence of those new forms of religious life, overflowing the boundaries, if you will, of the received traditions. So, we could list any number of figures that are prominent in this way, from Francis to Teresa to Luther to Howard Thurman. More recently, even people like in the evangelical world, the emergent church. So I think that the really interesting question for theological institutions, like the one I teach in, to wrestle with as we attempt to pass on particular theological traditions and commitments, is what happens to those traditions when they meet emergent forms of religious life, of spiritual expression. And then the question becomes, how do we discern what is, and I'm going to use this term very loosely and let it stand, as you say, Doug, for the moment, but how do we discern the authentic overflow of those boundaries that leads to new vitality and corrects the limitations of the traditions? How do we discern that from what is, in fact, faddish, trivial, even perhaps perverse? How do we employ the traditions, that is, how do we retrieve them and be informed by them in ways that are generative and life-giving and corrective rather than calcifying and stultifying in a way? So those are my reflections on the question.
Thank you, Bo.
Would you like to sit again? Okay. Hi again. I imagine a lot of you are very tired from this long day. A little stretch. I'm stretching on your behalf. Okay, so I'm going to remind you about one part of the question. Openness to studying spiritual experience. What does studying experience mean? Study experience. And I am going to quote two representative points on the spectrum to sort of describe this wide range of how we understand studying experience. The first is a quote from actually Bernie McGinn's chapter in Minding the Spirit. And I'd be curious to know, Bernie, in the next question, if you've changed your mind at all since writing that essay. He quotes from Gershom Scholem's Major Trends in Jewish Mysticism, a wonderful story from Hebrew novelist S.J. Agnon. So follow this story with me and you'll know where I'm heading. When the Baal Shem had a difficult task before him, he would go to a certain place in the woods, light a fire, and meditate in prayer. And what he had set out to perform was done. A generation later, the Maggid of Meseritz was faced with the same task. He would go to the same place in the woods and say, "We can no longer light the fire, but we can still speak the prayers." And what he wanted done became reality. A generation later, Rabbi Moshe Leib of Sasov had to perform this task. He too went into the woods and said, "You can guess by now, we can no longer light the fire, nor do we know the secret meditations belonging to the prayer. But we do know the place in the woods to which it all belongs, and that must be sufficient." And sufficient it was. Finally, another generation passes. Rabbi Israel of Rashin was called upon to perform the task. He sat down on his golden chair in his castle, and Bernie notes, obviously he was an academic. And he says, "We cannot light the fire. We cannot speak the prayers. We do not know the place in the woods. But we can tell the story of how it was done." And the storyteller adds, "The story which he told had the same effect as the actions of the other three." Implications in the classroom. What do you think? And Bernie intimates in that essay that Inviting or requiring students to participate in a spiritual experience need not be necessary for a vibrant study of the experience. And this story is a beautiful illustration of how that might be the case. On the other side of the spectrum, former professor of spirituality at YDS, Henry Nouwen, writes about different things that inspire his pedagogy in this field. And he writes this little story in the Genesee Diary. Okay, here we go. When someone is very excited about the stained glass windows that Marc Chagall made for the synagogue of the Hadassah Hebrew University Medical Center in Jerusalem, the only way to convince friends of their beauty is by bringing them into the synagogue. This idea stayed with me the whole day because it convinced me more than ever of the importance of teaching spirituality from the inside. Next semester, I will be fully occupied again with teaching. My task is not to make beautiful windows or to tell stories, but to lead students into the synagogue where they can see the splendid colors when the sunlight shines through them. As long as students say that they are interested in spirituality but prefer to remain on the outside, no argument, enthusiastic description, or rich vocabulary will make them see what I see. Only by entering with me into the experience with which spirituality deals will any real learning take place. Then he qualifies this. He says, well, that doesn't mean that critical distance is not available and that subjectivity is the only criterion. On the contrary, even from the inside, we can step back and remain critical. He adds, not everything we see from the inside is necessarily beautiful, worthwhile, or good. In fact, we are better able to make distinctions between bad and good, ugly and beautiful, appropriate and unfit from the inside than from the outside. He then asks the question, does this mean the only way to talk about prayer is by actually praying? And he says no. And he does speak of the complexities of introducing strangers into the world of prayer without inviting or even making them feel somewhat forced into a kind of behavior that makes them feel uncomfortable. So how do you introduce an experience and invite students into it without making anyone uncomfortable? And at a divinity school, this is a very important question. So at a theological seminary where faith commitments are assumed, which is part of the question, the part two of the question is, well, there's potential to bring about transformative change, to appreciate this beauty from the inside. How should it be viewed by theological schools? As a challenge, a worry, or an opportunity for theological renewal? When I was studying for my comps as a doctoral student, one theological treatise that grabbed my attention was Gordon Kaufman on theological method, and he argues that theologians should not be entangled through their belief system in the object of their study because it makes them overly subjective. And when I was writing my dissertation, I was always taught by my supervisors, don't bring yourself into it. Stop letting your faith influence your reading. Okay, objective, take my faith hat off. I was shocked later to discover that in this field, we're self-implicated. We're allowed to bring it in. In fact, Belden Lane argues in his essay in Exploring Christian Spirituality, the author of spiritual texts does a disservice to the reader by not showing ways in which they are deeply ingrained in their interpretation. So now I'm hearing, not only should I not leave myself out of it, I do an injustice by not bringing myself back into it. So where would we stand on this question? I think I'll conclude with three of my many, many favorite people. Jean Leclerc quotes from Gregory the Great, love itself is a form of knowledge. Loving God, loving the object of our study, the subject of our study, is a form of knowledge. And he expands, it's a deeper form of knowledge. Pascal would put it this way, the heart has its reasons, that famous quote, that reason with a capital R could never comprehend. And it's not that reason ever contradicts faith or that faith contradicts reason, but he argues that the level of the heart, the organ of the heart, is supra-rational. Not that it's against reason, but that it's beyond and above reason, that it opens us to things that we wouldn't know with logical propositions. And I'll quote with someone from the 17th century, one of my favorite female authors, Anna Maria von Schumann. She speaks of a kind of knowledge, intima notitia. The word intima can be translated as intimate or inmost. And she qualifies this phrase as intima notitia is different from the kind of study that keeps the student outside the subject. That kind of study is superficial and creates no change in the student or in the studier or the knower. But intima notitia, something happens on the inside. It's an intimate communion with the object and the subject of one's study. It's health-giving, salutary, and it is true. And we won't go into what she means by that word, but intimate, inmost, salutary knowledge. I hope that our seminaries won't be afraid of pursuing this kind of knowledge. And the attrition rate for our pastors in mainline denominations is strikingly high. Maybe if students were more deeply engaged in their study at this level, there would be a difference. I don't know. Thank you again.
Okay, there's 7 questions, and this is number 6. Philip Endine's argument hinges on distinguishing within the broad field of Christian studies 2 contrastive approaches, one more indebted in its methodology to religious studies, and the other more closely aligned with theology. Since Endine named Sandra Schneiders and Vernon McGinn as spokespersons for their relatively distinct approaches, I want to ask Sandra and Bernie first whether you feel Endine has correctly characterized your position, and second, whether your understanding of the disciplinary placement of Christian spirituality as a field within the Academy has changed in any way over the past 20 years.
Of course not.
I think you started to answer this question before, Sandra, but go ahead.
Okay. Well, let me start with the second question, and I'll also end with it. My theories about the field of spirituality have been greatly influenced by the actual experience of scholars in the field. What spirituality scholars are interested in, how they're approaching their work, and what kinds of results they produce. My position then has gotten more nuanced and clearer, but I think my basic understanding of the field and its place among the research disciplines in the Academy is not substantially different from what it was when I first began thinking and writing about the subject. This said, let me tackle the first question, what do I actually think? And in relationship to what Philip Endine thinks I think. Although I think Professor Endine's description of a religious studies approach to spirituality as an ideal type can be useful in general discussion of the field, especially for scholars who want to prescind from consideration of confessional concerns in the interest of phenomenological and comparative work. I do not recognize myself or my work in that description. For one thing, I'm not academically trained or prepared in the field of religious studies and have never approached my own work in that framework, and it certainly doesn't supply my methodology. I began my own work in the field of spirituality in the area in which I continue to work, namely biblical spirituality, specifically New Testament spirituality. That situates me immediately in the Judeo-Christian context rather than the comparative context, which is more characteristic of religious studies. And since I'm dealing with the New Testament, not as an instance of sacred texts in general, but specifically as the canonical text or sacred scripture of the Christian community, I'm always involved in my subject matter as a confessionally committed participant in the dynamics of Christian revelation, rather than as an objective observer of how sacred texts, for example, function or can function in religious traditions in general. This self-situation within which I've often referred to as the broad tent of theological studies, which includes not only the classical fields of systematic and moral theology, but history of Christianity, fundamental theology, comparative theology, practical theology, pastoral studies, biblical studies, and the like, is determinative of my methodology. My specialization in the broad field of Christian spirituality, namely biblical spirituality, specifies my methodology as primarily hermeneutical, including exegesis, criticism, biblical theology, literary and philosophical hermeneutics, including exegesis, criticism, biblical theology, literary and philosophical theories of interpretation, rather than purely descriptive analytical methods, which are more characteristic, I believe, of religious studies. So, to summarize what I've suggested in much greater detail in various writings over the last 20, 30, however many years, first, I consider the subject matter of spirituality to be religious or quasi-religious experience as religious and as experience. In this sense, the field is anthropologically rooted. All humans, as humans, I believe, have the capacity for self-transcendence and or relationship with the transcendent, with a capital T. This provides the basis for conversation about spirituality across and even beyond religious traditions. But just as there is no language in general, but only specific languages, there is no spirituality in general, but only specific spiritualities, which may or may not be confessionally situated. So, along with Christian or Buddhist spirituality, we can have, for example, feminist or ecological or pacifist spiritualities, which may not be religiously contextualized. In other words, the methodology for spirituality studies as such, while necessarily interdisciplinary, in my opinion, does not necessarily include theology among those disciplines. In other words, if the spirituality being studied is not religiously contextualized, it may not include theology as part of its methodology. For religious spiritualities, theology is intrinsic to their project, but this is not necessarily the case for secular or non-theistic spiritualities. Once one specifies one's interests and projects within the context of a specific spiritual or religious tradition, for example, Jewish or Christian or Hindu, the religious dimension of the spirituality, meaning, of course, creed, code, cult, religion, comes into play. And for Christians, theology as such then becomes a necessary part of the methodology, because it's Christian and religious, not because it's spirituality. At this point, Christian spirituality as a field subdivides or branches out into disciplinary specializations, such as biblical spirituality, history of Christian spirituality, formation in or formative spirituality, theological spirituality, practical spirituality, spirituality of particular families or vocations, and so on. My concern in approaching the field in this funneling way, from spirituality to particular spiritualities, to particular religious spiritualities, to Christian particular religious spirituality, to a discipline-defined specialization within Christian spirituality, has always been twofold. My purpose in this. First, to keep Christian spirituality within the anthropological context of the human search for the ultimate, which will keep it related to the broader discussion of spirituality as a human enterprise, rather than encapsulated within the private concern of an enclave, even a very large enclave like Christianity. And second, to keep the discourse of Christian spirituality in the public domain, where it has to make sense, not just to its in-house practitioners, but to anyone who is willing to make the effort to enter the conversation. The emergence of Islam in the past 20 years or so as a world religion and the importance in Islam of its spirituality has confirmed me in this twofold commitment that I've had from the very beginning, to do Christian spirituality rigorously as Christian, and to keep my scholarship in Christian spirituality open to and in dialogue with spirituality as a human enterprise in all its rich and problematic diversity.
Thank you
So
very
I guess, Philip, the answer is probably no.
Thank you very much, Sandra. Bernie, what do you have to say?
You've all been wonderfully patient. And we soon hope you'll be filled, if not with the Spirit, at least with some of the spirits that I think are coming up over at Gavin House. I suppose, given reflections on the past, I can say I withdraw nothing, but I've forgotten much of what I have said. I think everybody in this room at one time or another has been asked by some audience, class, or otherwise to define spirituality. What do you mean by spirituality? And what do? We fumble, we mumble. If we've written on this and made a little definition of our own, we quote it and hope that the person will be convinced. We don't really know what spirituality is. In the same way that we don't really know what religion is, but it's a lived reality. It's a very important part of the study of religion that goes on in a place like this, Swift Hall, is the contesting definitions and understandings of religion that keep this process going. And I think that's what we're involved in with spirituality. We have different kinds of understandings, and those understandings are going to develop. And I don't think we should ever think that we're going to arrive at some kind of common definition. That'd be the death of what we're doing to a large extent. And what that means, of course, is that we're going to have diverse approaches, methodologies, and diverse academic situations. I mean, I have said often in the past that theology needs spirituality as much as spirituality needs theology. And one might say that the anthropological sciences, if that kind of dialogue goes on, which indeed it should, needs spirituality as much as spirituality needs those kinds of human sciences as well, anthropological, sociological, etc. So in a sense, let 1,000 blossoms, flowers bloom, as long as they're well cultivated and carefully done in the academic sense. And the idea that existed 2 generations ago that somehow theology was not dialogical and spirituality was, that's dead as far as good theology is involved today. All theology has to be dialogical. Dialogical with other traditions, dialogical with other disciplines, etc. The one thing that worries me, and this is where I'll stop my remarks, we had a wonderful teacher in Swift Hall in the 1950s and 1960s, a Lutheran theologian, Joseph Sittler, who was very much involved in the early stages of the ecumenical movement. And I once asked Joe Sittler 30, 40 years ago to reflect for me what he thought the meaning of the ecumenical movement was. And he said to me, well, he said, I think we've been moving around the furniture in a house where the party has moved somewhere else. And this is what I think we need to think about in terms of spirituality today. That maybe one of the other houses they're moving to is a house called spirituality, but its spirituality is the least common denominator. How do we make relationships between spirituality of lived religious traditions and the vague spirituality that attracts so many people in our culture?
Thank you. Now the last question is rapid fire, so everyone gets 1 sentence. All right. Given the recent rise of studies of spirituality in many disciplines other than theology, what do you foresee for Christian spirituality studies in the next 10 years? All right. We'll just go in order. Just rapid fire, starting with Doug.
I hope for studies that are more integrated, more synthesized, more whole, more seamless, that bear the fruit of all this long work we've been doing to reach exactly that kind of vision.
I think we need both and religious studies and theological varieties. We need Christian spirituality to be unashamed of having a lived tradition and studying from within, but I also think we need to be mindful of contexts in which faith cannot be assumed, and so we need to stay in conversation with and speak the language of those not within the tradition. I think we need both, and
my hope for these coming years is that this deep interiority of our tradition that listens well and long will more and more fully move the practice and scholarship of Christian spirituality outdoors, inside out, outside in.
I anticipate increased attention to the diversity and contextuality we've been talking about, increased attention to formational sorts of studies, and thus increasing dialogue with practical theologians and practical theology, and increasing interest in interfaith, interreligious concerns, multiple and hybrid identities and practices.
Thank you.
Well, rather following on from Bernie's last remark, I hope following on Bernie's last remark, I hope that Christian spirituality over the next 10 years will become much more obviously a collaborative and at the same time critical voice within discussions about spirituality out with religious traditions. My limited experience has been in healthcare and in with urban professionals, architects and urban planners who are beginning to use the language of spirituality as a means of trying to embody values and purpose beyond the technologies of their discipline, the value-added factor, but lack a spiritual vocabulary. And once they realize you're not out to proselytize them, but are trying to offer something from within the riches of your religious tradition, I found them very open to it, particularly in approaches to understandings of what the human person that lie at the heart of so much Christian spirituality. So that's what I hope for, that will make a much better contribution to that debate.
Pass the microphone.
I expect Christian spirituality to remain true to itself as a specific, confessionally contextualized and committed inquiry, but to be more and more open to genuine dialogue with people studying non-Christian spiritualities, whether in the context of religious studies or as different confessionally committed religious spiritualities. And I hope it will have a robust identity and distinctive voice, but that it will use that voice not to massage some sense of private specialness or privilege, but to participate in the public discourse about what is important and valuable for the whole human family.
When I look at the role of religion in contemporary society, I think I see a tremendous split between the growth of religious fundamentalisms in so many traditions and the tremendous interest in spirituality and world religions. I think these are the opposing forces in the world we have today. And so it seems to me we really need to encourage greater understanding of spirituality and cooperation between the spiritual dimensions of the world religions as the antidote to the narrowness of religious fundamentalisms.
When I think of the study of Christian spirituality and look into the future, I didn't necessarily look to the past. And I think that the great spiritual figures of our past have shown us that union with God necessarily means union with those whom God loves. And so that I would encourage us to be a self-implicating interdisciplinary field, but also socio-implicating in the sense of moving towards social justice, towards better social relationships with the different religions, the different non-religions, the different spiritualities that are out there.
All right, I think we've reached the point, and that clock is 5 minutes fast, so we're really on time, that we will thank our panelists, and let's do that first, a round of applause.
You're doing great.
All right, and now we go to Gavin House for our gala reception. It's about 2 blocks down on 58th Street, 1220. So it's the same. Is someone here from the University of Chicago that knows Gavin House?
Yeah, I can.
Okay, all right, so Bernie will be our guide, the 2 blocks down.
I'll be the Pied Piper.
All right, Bernie is our Pied Piper.